Okay, welcome back, everybody. We have been having a wonderful day. We've been seeing your discussion unfold here in the live meeting rooms with all of our curators and educators here at the Smithsonian. And as you've noticed, they've come from all different units, all different museums and groups across the Smithsonian, from people who study the history of the Smithsonian itself to people looking at faces and portraits at the National Portrait Gallery. And in fact, that's where we are today. We're going to go even a little bit deeper into looking at portraits today with Briana White, who is joining us from the Portrait Gallery. She's a colleague of David Ward, who we just heard from. She's going to take us on an educational journey through some of the content that we've been looking at today. Don't forget, you can pose your questions at any time in the chat box, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you share with us as we go along. And I'm going to go ahead and also thank Smithsonian Education, which is the group here at the Smithsonian that has convened the conference. And they've been a fantastic group to work with and a real great power to bring together all these wonderful groups. But with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn the floor over to Briana White. And she is a school and teacher program coordinator at the National Portrait Gallery. And let me turn to her. Briana.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good afternoon, everyone. So over the next hour, we are going to be talking about how to apply what you heard from David to the classroom, really. For those of you that were not a part of David's session, we're talking about applying images of Lincoln from One Life, the Mask of Lincoln, which is an exhibition currently at the Portrait Gallery. It's up until July 5th of this year, how to use these portraits of Lincoln in the classroom. And really, as a whole, how you can use portraits in the classroom. So if we could move to our first question, really, for everybody.
All right, and the question that's coming up is right there. What is a portrait?
So I'd like to open this up. I want to just preface this, of course, by saying that this session is highly interactive. Without your responses, you're going to be listening to me for the next 50 minutes, which is going to be rather boring. So I'd like to hear what everybody has to say when the questions do pop up. So I'd like to hear from you. What is a portrait?
And I'm going to actually put up a special box on the screen just to answer this question. So we'll put it up over here on the right side of the screen for all of you. So what is a portrait? Go ahead and tell us in that box to the right. How would you define a portrait? All right, we have some responses coming in here. An artistic portrayal, pictorial representation, good stuff.
Okay. Leah says it's a realistic representation of a subject. Okay, a painting of a certain person, absolutely. A likeness of a subject.
The artist says the artist chosen likeness of the person. Interesting.
Yes, absolutely. And it is something that you always have to remember is portraits, of course, are representations of individuals, likenesses of individuals, and we always do need to consider what the artist is trying to say about the person in the portrait, or what we call at the Portrait Gallery, the sitter. Sometimes it's not necessarily of, the face. It could be of, the back of someone's head, or it could be the hand. These are all things that you need to consider. Of course, for us and today, we are talking about Lincoln. And it is also important to remember that a portrait can take the form of various media. You can use painting and sculpture and photography, prints and drawings, and now mixed media, and there's even video portraiture out there. Here at the Portrait Gallery, we tell the story of America through the individuals who have shaped U.S. culture. So our focus is on the sitter, the person in the portrait, and not necessarily the artist. So our focus is contribution of the sitter, and what does the portrait say about the person, the time in which they lived, and again, their contribution.
Great. Well, we have quite a collection in here, by the way. We also had someone who said that a portrait is a representation of a person from the chest up. Is that true? Can a portrait, is it only, are they thinking perhaps of a bust?
You are thinking of a bust in this case, absolutely. A portrait really can be any and all things, as long as we are talking about the likeness of an individual. The Portrait Gallery was recently part of an exhibition a few years ago where we had digital DNA, and that is considered a portrait. So it is. I mean, it's a tricky question, and it's a question that if you decide to use portraits in the classroom, how you want to define it with your students. There's another portrait that I've seen, which is of the hand of Constantine Brancusi, the sculptor. So again, it doesn't necessarily have to be chest up. It doesn't necessarily even have to be of the face.
Great. Well, thanks to everyone for contributing their ideas about what a portrait is. And here's a couple of portraits, if you will.
Yes. So again, for those of you that were part of David Ward's presentation in the last hour, he certainly did talk about these two life masks of Abraham Lincoln, but I bring them up just as a placeholder to answer this question, which is, what does it mean to read a portrait? So please consider, what does it mean to read a portrait?
And let's put up a box here next to one of these life masks and get some of your thoughts. If you were reading a portrait, what would you be doing? What does it mean to be reading a portrait? And there's a box there on the left you can type in there.
And as we look at responses coming up, I ask this question because at the Portrait Gallery we use visual clues found in our objects in these portraits to learn about individuals. And I'm just looking at what people are saying. I saw that somebody said compare and contrast, to interpret what you see. That's from Kim at Corinth School District.
To read, okay, to note
yes.
the likeness and differences, yeah.
And Wayne was talking about color and line. That is absolutely correct. I often tell both school groups and teacher groups when visiting the Portrait Gallery that we read a portrait just like we would read a biography. A portrait is simply a snapshot or a moment in time for the sitter, whereas, of course, a biography typically spans someone's life.
As we scroll through and look at some of your responses, I hope you're doing the same, too, because we have a lot to learn from each other here during the conference.
And Samantha says that by realizing what the details are, and that is certainly a focus of reading portraiture, is focusing in on the details, focusing in on what you see. Okay.
All right. So if you're typing something right now, you can finish it or put a ... and send it in, and then we'll move on from here. But it is really an interesting way of thinking about looking at images as reading them. We often think about reading words, but you can read images as well.
Exactly.
All right, great.
So in my 6+ years at the Portrait Gallery, I have learned that the hardest question that you can ask of anybody is simply, what do you see? And I think that the reason for that is because people automatically want to interpret and they want to make meaning out of some visual image that is in front of them, but we have to focus on what we see first. So again, it's a question that I pose to all of you for this portrait, which is, again, as David mentioned, the portrait that was taken by Matthew Brady, February 27th, 1860. This is the portrait that Lincoln said, along with the Cooper Union speech, made him president. So what do you see? Remember, you need to focus on the visual. Kathy says wrinkled clothing. Okay, Carolyn says a posed picture.
A serious expression, well-dressed, groomed, tall man, said Susan.
Okay.
A strong
Absolutely.
face, Vanessa points out.
Okay, somebody said a difference in sleeve length. I like that. I like the closeness of detail that you're considering here. A gaunt-looking man. Rosella says a man who wasn't planning on taking a picture. Okay.
There are a few people who've pointed out the books, including C.J. Davis at Bomford Academy.
Okay. And I see people, I have to tell you that I see people interpreting. They say that they see a strong man with kind eyes and strong hands. Consider that is an interpretation, because what you view as that, somebody else may view as something different. Jenny said a column, jawline, the weight of the world on his shoulder. Again, and that came from Megan. The weight of the world on his shoulders, again, I think is in interpretation here, and I think it is absolutely a valid point. But again, let's focus on what we see.
So if we were to do a comparison here between reading a book and interpreting what we're reading,
right
now we're reading the words. We're just reading what it says. We're not
Exactly.
making any judgments about it.
Yes.
We're not reading between the lines.
Yes.
We're just reading what we see on the picture.
Right, exactly. And it is, as in reading a book, it's just simply reading the words that you see, absolutely. So if I were to look at this piece and I were to read this portrait, and I would ask this question, what do you see? I would say things like, I see the column, I see this man's hand resting on a book, I see what looks like a larger book underneath of the smaller book, or perhaps that's part of the table. I see that he is wearing a suit. And that given that this is black and white photography, that it is most likely a black suit with a white shirt. I see that he has dark hair. I see that he is looking out at the viewer. These are all things that you see, and all things that are so important when reading a portrait, because we have to focus on this before we can interpret. So often I find that that people focus on label text, and they focus on other things outside of the image, and we're talking about visual literacy here. You know, you would read a portrait very similar to the way that you would read any artwork, whether it be a landscape, an allegorical painting, etc.
That's actually a really powerful comment you just made. We teach people how to read words, read books, and images convey just as much, if not more, information. They say a picture says 1,000 words. So if we know how to read a picture, there may be 1,000 words for us to describe it.
It definitely does. Definitely does. And it's interesting because, you know, when people come to the gallery, I always tell them that they should focus on the image itself rather than focusing on the label text, because, I mean, the image should be our primary focus. As museum educators, you know, we believe in object-based learning, so the image is absolutely the focus for us. And again, as I said before, what clues can you find in the image that tell you about this person's life, and in this case, that tell you about Lincoln's life? And as David said, you know, when you get into analyzing this portrait, you see that Lincoln does look serious. There is a reason why he is looking out at the viewer. It is because this carte de visite was mass-produced, mailed out, and used to help elect him as president. The artist has definitely tweaked, for lack of a better word, this likeness of Lincoln to make him not look so unappealing. The artist Matthew Brady actually heightened up the collar so you wouldn't see that Lincoln's neck was so long. He definitely, it's nice to know what I like to call the backstory of a portrait, and I think it helps teachers teach portraits in the classroom.
A quick question, Briana.
Sure.
Somebody made the observation in reading this picture that it's a picture of an educated upper-class man. Is that a reading, or are we going a step beyond reading to go that far?
I think we're going a step beyond reading, but it's an interesting point because I can see how that person is making that jump, again, because of what he's wearing. Lincoln was definitely the first president to really use photography as a medium to get his likeness out there, but we still see him wearing a suit. And while cartes de visite were fairly inexpensive to mass produce, they certainly did cost money. So yes, he was a man of means, and we know that by what he's wearing.
Great. That was a really powerful activity for me to begin to think about how to read what do you see in a photograph. What do we have here?
What do you need to consider when looking at a portrait? And again, I want you all to think about looking, okay? We're talking about looking here. And I think what Jonathan is going to do is pull up a poll.
Exactly. We're going to bring that up on your screen now.
So again, what do you need to consider when looking at a portrait?
Now I have this set for one item, but people might want to choose more than one, isn't that right?
That's fine.
So let me go ahead and actually allow you to check more than one if you would like to. So I'm going to reopen that poll now. You can click as many as you wish. And we'll watch those results fly in here with all of you.
Interesting. Okay, I see that setting is coming up more than all of the others.
Interesting. So
okay.
These are all things we would be looking at as we read.
Yep.
As we read an image.
Yes.
Okay.
So really, for us at the Portrait Gallery, we do consider all of these when looking at the portrait. And I find it interesting that setting came up as 58%, more than the others, because it is everything. Setting is just as important as any of the other topics that have come up. I do find it interesting also that adjectives has hardly come up at all, because I think that depending on your age level of students, adjectives is probably something that is going to come up more than a lot of the other topics that are up for the polling. I think that, again, students they want to describe, and I think that they will do that with adjectives. And Jonathan, if you could take us to the next slide.
You bet.
And I did just want to put up here as a point of reference what kind of questions you would ask related to these various topics when looking at a portrait. So your sitter, again, the person in the portrait, you're describing the sitter's pose here. Again, this is looking. This is not interpreting. This is not analyzing yet. So we don't actually want to know who the sitter is yet. Symbols. I am a firm believer that if you are going to use portraits in the classroom, there are really three key terms that you need to define with your students before you get started. Of course, what a portrait is, what a sitter is, because many people have not heard of it, but also what is a symbol, because outside of the likeness of the person, I would say symbols within the object itself, within the portrait, are just as important. So for instance, in the Matthew Brady piece that was on the previous page that we looked at, there was the column and there was the book. Okay, well, it's great to be able to reference those, again, when looking at a portrait for when we later start to analyze the portrait. So if we could go back, so again, adjectives. Use adjectives to describe the sitter. Clothing. What clothing is the sitter wearing? And again, here, depending on the age level of your students, I might really want to get into I might want to consider jumping into the portrait. Have your students consider what the clothing might feel like if they could touch it. Again, because oftentimes portraiture is not is not as exciting, I think, as other images that students might see. So to have them deeply involved, I think, is important. So consider having them jump in. Media. I think it is important to identify what media is used to create a portrait. We live in a world with lots of different stimuli, and people often want to look at a portrait and say, oh, okay, it's a picture, or people define portraiture as strictly being painting, and that is certainly not the case, and you can certainly see from the Mask of Lincoln show that that's not the case, because the majority of the pieces are photographs. And again, back to the ever-important setting. What is the setting of the portrait? Describe where the sitter is. So after we've exhausted looking questions, we then move on to analyzing. And these are the things that should be brought up when analyzing a portrait. This is really when you get into the meat of the image. Who is the sitter? How do you know it's Abraham Lincoln in the portrait? I ask this question a lot when we look at one of the portrait gallery's most iconic images, which is of George Washington. And really the answer is because you've seen Lincoln before. Lincoln is in textbooks just like George Washington is. Again, so before we identified symbols by what objects are in the portrait, now we can simply ask, okay, well, what do these objects tell us about the sitter? And then I'd actually like to jump ahead for a second and go down to biography, because from what you see, from what those symbols are, you can ask the question, what is the sitter's contribution? In a lot of cases, not all. Again, here you can jump back up and talk about who the artist is, when the portrait was created. For the Cooper Union portrait, what is the significance of February 27th, 1860? I mean, it has great significance. And this again goes to the backstory that I was talking about. And finally, again, because the Portrait Gallery considers itself to be a history and biography museum, what was going on in history when this portrait was created? Okay, now I feel like I've talked entirely too much. So, this portrait, which David did not get to touch on very much, so I will just give you a very brief overview. This portrait was taken in February of 1865. It is, of course, a photograph. It is one of the last life sittings that Abraham Lincoln did. This piece, for those of you that might know it, is called the Cracked Plate Portrait of Abraham Lincoln. If you put this portrait up in your classroom for your students, what kind of looking questions would you ask when viewing this piece? Right. I would love to hear your thoughts.
All right, let's try it. So on the box just to the left of the Cracked Plate Lincoln, there's a space where you can type in, and you can type in that box just to the left of his picture.
Okay, great. Samantha says, what was the background to the portrait? Do you think the picture was taken at the end or the beginning of the Civil War? I think that is fantastic. Oh, okay. Why or how was it broken? Somebody asks. I want you to keep that question. I don't necessarily know that I would ask that right away, because how do we know that it was broken? What do you think he's thinking? That's another great one. Again, I want you to consider looking questions here. Okay, Addie says, why do you think his tie is askew? That is a fantastic question to ask. How does this picture compare with other pictures that you have seen? Another one, Carolyn Wiseman from Friona Elementary asked, why is his suit blurry? That is fantastic. And of course, the question that can go along with that is, why is his face focused? And again, okay, so Benjamin Dixon asks, why is it cracked? again, if we're thinking about looking questions, we don't necessarily know yet that this is the cracked plate portrait if you were to put this up in your classroom. But a very simple way to ask about the image itself is, why is there a line running through Abraham Lincoln's head in this portrait? Why is he seated diagonally? Okay, absolutely. Okay, what age is he and how would you tell? Does he look happy? This is another great one. Why is there nothing else in this photo? I think that's a fantastic question, again, because a lot of the other images that we've seen of Lincoln, there is some sort of background, whether it's, you know, Lincoln sitting next to a table with the quill and the inkwell, or Lincoln standing next to a book. Okay, so why is, Robin Kapler asks, why is his right eye dark? Why is the image of Lincoln not centered? These are all great questions. I think, too, this is another fantastic one to ask this, you know, what do you see question. Something else to consider as well is, at the portrait gallery we have what we've termed learning to look strategies. So beyond the simple questions that you might ask your students, you know, what do you see? Who is this in the portrait? What symbols are there? We've come up with strategies or activities, challenges that you can use with your students, and this what do you see is very similar to that. And what you can ask is, you can explain to your students that they all need to come up with one thing that they've seen in this portrait. And again, this idea of he's wearing a beard, he has a white shirt, and have students come up with maybe one or two in their head, because typically someone will take someone else's. So you start out with one student in the class and they say, I see a man, and they turn to their fellow student and they say, what do you see? And the next student says, I see a man and a tie. What do you see? And they turn to their next student. And you go on and on like that. And it really challenges students to, again, focus on the looking. Oh, and this is another great question from Sonia Williams. What is his strongest physical feature in this portrait? That is a great one. So some of you are asking about really about the backstory of this portrait. And like I said before, the backstory can be so important when talking to students. Basically, like I said, this portrait was taken by Alexander Gardner in February 1865. It was one of the last formal sittings that Lincoln sat for, and there were a number of portraits that were taken of Lincoln on this day. This one stands out more than the others for two reasons. One, because Lincoln has a slight smile. And only one print of this portrait was created, because at this time in photography, and you'll have to excuse me because I'm certainly not an expert of photography of this era, the photograph was taken onto a glass plate negative, and that negative broke, it cracked right after the photograph was taken, and only one print was able to be created. And the portrait gallery owns that single print of Lincoln with this slight smile that we never have an opportunity to see. I would challenge all of you to go into the One Life, the Mask of Lincoln online exhibition and take a look at the other portraits, because it is incredibly rare that you see Lincoln actually smiling. So the crack has taken on two meanings really in history. One is that it is a foreshadowing of what is to come 2 months later. But the other interpretation is that it's the break of the Union. It's the crack of the Union. And if I'd like to take a minute as well to just mention another great activity to do with this piece, as well as that Matthew Brady piece from earlier, a compare and contrast. Ask your students which came first, which came second. Put both images up on the screen and ask them which portrait is Lincoln in 1860 and which is Lincoln in 1865. I know that in the exhibit hall, the Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies has put up their latest issue of Smithsonian in Your Classroom. And they have great activities in there, but they also have these images. And you can do a timeline and include other images of Lincoln as well. Really, how the Civil War took its toll on him, on his likeness. I mean, it is an extraordinary contrast to look at Lincoln in 1860 and look at Lincoln in 1865. Okay.
Great.
So this was the last piece that that David Ward talked about in the last hour, and this is probably my most favorite image in the One Life, the Mask of Lincoln show, because it tells such a fantastic story. There are so many springboards, and again, I probably haven't said this because I say it so often. At the Portrait Gallery, we use the portrait as a springboard into a conversation about biography, about history, and this is such a great piece to do that with. So again, it is helpful to have that backstory. It is helpful to know that Lincoln has just arrived in Richmond. This is April 4th, 1865. You know, Richmond basically has been burning because the Confederacy has set fire to various warehouses around Richmond. Lincoln was not announced when he arrived. He just decided that he could not let this moment pass by without him being there, which is just such an incredible thing to think about. So you have this image again with your students. What might you do with it? Okay, so Diane Dawson would ask her students why the artist has idealized this moment in history. And I think that that's a great question. I think that we also do need to consider that this is a documentary drawing. It is unfortunate that there were no photographs taken of this moment. So we do always need to consider artist's interpretation. Okay. What does the drawing tell us about Lincoln? Sure, I think that is certainly a great question. Okay, Megan Mosman would use this piece as a hook to studying Emancipation Proclamation. I think another great image to use would be the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, which I'll show you in just a bit. Okay, and Samantha asks, where is this located? This is Richmond, Virginia. This is April 4th, 1865. If you can see it, I think that some of the springboards that you can use are, again, you have Lincoln, you have his son Tad. On Lincoln's right, you have Admiral David Porter, who was one of his bodyguards. You see that he's holding Lincoln. In the upper right-hand corner, you see a window, and of course it's very hard to make out, but there's a shadow of a figure in the window. What might that tell us? This is Richmond, Virginia. He's just gotten off of the dock. You know, we're looking at people's homes, these row houses all along this street. So we're not necessarily seeing we're only seeing the outline of a figure here. What is the building in the far background, whether it's the State House, the Executive Mansion for the Confederacy? Addie Kinsley asks, are there other pictures of the same area to make comparisons? Not that I know of. This is the one documentary drawing of this scene. It, of course, has been reproduced over and over and over again. Let's see.
Melanie is talking about the image in the window and saying a Southerner, maybe the window is a Southerner, might be interested in Lincoln but afraid of being seen amongst him and the slaves.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I agree with you on that. And this idea that, some of the other windows are shuttered so as not to see Lincoln arriving. And of course, in front of Lincoln you have the military, you have bodyguards, and behind Lincoln you have these freed African American slaves. I mean, it is just such a tremendous picture to use. Now, I want everyone to think about, okay, so you've studied the portrait in the classroom, but then what is the next step? What is the big so what? What's going to be the culminating activity that you might do with your students after studying this image? I mean, think about, you're studying the end of the Civil War with your students, you're moving on into Reconstruction. How might you use this image as a springboard? What other activities can you use? Kim asks, was it unusual for Tad to accompany Lincoln to events like this? I honestly don't know. I do know that it is Tad's birthday on April 4th, 1865, and that is one of the reasons why Tad is with Lincoln. Oh, okay. Sonia Williams says maybe have the students tell us what happened next. Yes, I think that is a great activity for students to do. How does this picture depict what was won in the Civil War? That's great. Why are the whites and the blacks separated? I think that is an interesting question to consider with your class, certainly. Okay, Christopher at Coffee Middle School says that he would ask students to tell the story from perspectives of different participants in the portrait. Absolutely, I think that is a very interesting activity. And the perspectives could be from a freed African American slave, from a white Southerner who is up in his or her home, behind a shuttered window, from Tad's perspective, or from a perspective of David Porter, certainly. And I think that you can go about doing this in so many different ways, whether having students write a journal entry or having them or write a newspaper article from the perspective of various people who could be in this scene, or who could have witnessed it. Monologues is also another great idea. Okay, again, I see an article for different papers. I think that, yes, absolutely. And having students act it out. Having students do Tableau in the classroom is great. I think oftentimes students don't necessarily want to draw portraits of themselves, and they don't necessarily want to act. And I think Tableau is certainly a nice compromise for acting. And Christine asks, how old was Lincoln in this picture? Lincoln was born in 1809, and this is 1865. So 54. Math is certainly not my strong suit. 54, right? Yes. Okay.
By the way, the kinds of activities and ideas that people are sharing right now, I mean, this is just off of one, albeit a very powerful photograph.
Right.
So in the kind of approach you're teaching us with regards to this photo certainly carries to any others and to the contrast and comparison between two. And we hope you'll add some of your own ideas if you've done other kinds of visual literacy and reading photograph lessons. Maybe you'll post links or post them on the discussion board as well. We'd love to have more sharing.
Absolutely. I think that it's always great when teachers can get together and come up with ideas, because you're the ones that are in the classroom, and you certainly know what works with your students. Can I explain Tableau?
Yes.
I can certainly explain Tableau. Tableau is an idea of is really an idea of acting, but not actually going through the motions of acting. So it's the physicality of showing this scene, but not having to show the movement of it. So if you assign your students various people in this portrait and have them go to the front of the classroom or wherever you are and have them set themselves up as this portrait is, that is Tableau. And then have them consider perhaps maybe 2 to 3 or however many you'd like scenes that would follow this one. So let's consider, 2 minutes after this, what is the scene going to be? Could the African American woman on our right and the African American man on our left, could they have reached each other? Or could Lincoln be shaking again that African American man's hand on the left in the second scene of the tableau? So it's this idea that students can act out a scene without actually having to talk or to go through the movement. Again, it's a great way. It's a great way to use portraiture in the classroom. It's a great springboard from looking at a portrait.
Yeah.
Have any other questions come up that I've missed?
There are plenty of ideas and being shared here.
Okay.
I mean, you can't help but to, when you do a tableau like that, to really help the students to portraying the different roles, to really understand what it might have felt like. How did Lincoln feel arriving in this jubilant scene? How did each of the other people in this scene feel? So it's a really powerful activity.
So you could certainly do a tableau activity in conjunction with journal entries. Again, if a student is taking on the role of any of the people in this portrait, they can consider what that person felt like at any of your really tableau points.
Great. All right. I'm going to go ahead and take us to this question, which is totally different.
Totally different.
But somebody asked this question during David's presentation, and now is the chance to find out what the answer is.
Okay, so it's for all of you to decide, how many portraits of Lincoln does the National Portrait Gallery own? Again, consider that David said that we have a fantastic collection of Lincoln, and consider that our mission is to tell the story of America through the people who have shaped it.
Well,
okay.
People are. We have a bit of a bell curve here, or almost. Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit, don't we?
You've got 76. I think it's not too few and not too many. It's right there in the middle of your range.
It is actually 105 portraits of Lincoln.
Okay, you can't change your answer now. If you change your answer, you have to come here within the next 3 weeks and look at all of them that are on display at the exhibit. We hope you will.
And the reason why I wanted to ask all of you is because I want you to understand that while One Life, The Mask of Lincoln is a fantastic show, it is by no means the only portraits of Lincoln that we have in our collection. We do have a number of other fantastic images, a number of paintings of Lincoln. So there is a link, I believe, in the Portrait Gallery's exhibit hall of our NPG collection search. And if you search Abraham Lincoln, you'll come up with all of the images that we own. And again, there are so many great ones. And if you decide that you want to do a timeline activity, as I mentioned earlier, see some of the images that are up and use those for your timeline activity. So Jonathan has up on the screen now the online exhibition for One Life, The Mask of Lincoln. I think that this is a great resource for you to use in your classroom for those of you that can't come to the show and don't have the opportunity to get here. The images that are up in the exhibition are also online. And you'll see, if you can see, it's broken down by introduction, the rise of Lincoln, the Civil War, and Lincoln's contemporaries. And when you click on any of the images, it pops up larger, so your students can see it in the classroom, however you're projecting it. And it also pops up with information about Lincoln at that time, information about the portrait, that backstory that I was talking about for you to use. This next slide is lesson plans. So a lot of the ideas that you've had have been fantastic and are actually very similar to the ones that the Portrait Gallery has come up with. On this page you will find 5 different lesson plans related to this exhibition. Again, you see Lincoln in Photography, A Closer Look, Lincoln in Richmond, The Life Masks, the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is one of my favorite lessons to use because we actually do Tableau. That is a great one because there was such a debate among Lincoln and his cabinet members about the Emancipation Proclamation. Have your students research it from the perspective of each of Lincoln's cabinet members. Have them take on those roles, and again, do a tableau. It's this idea of acting it out without actually having to talk. And then again, this last one is Whitman and Lincoln, which is a collaboration with the Choral Arts Society of Washington. And Jonathan just popped up. Yes, this is just what our lesson plans look like. We talk about target grade level objectives, of course, for the lesson. The portrait or portraits that we use. We include background information for teachers. And then we go into really the procedure, the portrait activity, as well as the extension activities that we would do related to those objects.
Great. And remember, all of these links can be found inside the virtual exhibit hall, so no need to take them down, although the links of the pictures on your screen actually link out to these lesson plans.
And again, this is the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, what a fantastic image to use in your classroom. Just like Lincoln and Richmond, it tells such a great story. And it is incredibly easy to quote-unquote read, as we talked about before. So think about the pose of these sitters, again, the setting, what objects might be in this portrait. And again, if you take a look at the lesson plan online, we've listed out for you in the background information for teachers what some of these maps and books are that are on the table. So that backstory is incredibly helpful when teaching your students.
A couple of other quick links you'll find in the exhibit hall is the main education area of the National Portrait Gallery's website. And Briana has also included for us in the exhibit hall a direct link to the Reading Portraiture Guide for Educators,
yes,
which is really fantastic and really gets into what you took us through and modeled for us today.
Yes, I would recommend everybody take a look at that. It definitely, it's a great resource. It's sort of a one-stop shop on how to read portraiture with your students. Again, it goes through those learning to look strategies that I mentioned briefly. There are a number of them that we use, but it also gives you sample questions that you can use in the classroom. And what Jonathan has up on the screen now is really what we had talked about earlier, this idea of looking and analyzing and the difference between the two. So certainly check out the exhibit hall, download this document. It's 4 pages and what I consider to be a great resource.
And you'll also find a link to a great program called Posters to Go, which gets posters in the hands of...
This is my plug, right?
It's your plug. Go for
This
it.
is my plug. These Posters to Go were funded by the Smithsonian School Programming Fund. They are a set of 15 posters. It was a collaboration among the Portrait Gallery, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and the Archives of American Art. Like I said, 15 posters representing 5 eras in history, one representation from each of the 3 units, organizations, and they're just fantastic because it is a laminated poster, 17 by 23-ish, image on one side, information, learning to look questions, and activity suggestions on the back side. And for all of you that are interested in Lincoln, the Portrait Gallery's contribution to the Civil War era was the cracked plate portrait of Lincoln. So if you are interested in acquiring a set, it is an application process, and there is a link on the exhibit hall about where to go to apply. There is a finite number of them, so if you're interested, apply now.
All right. Briana, this has been, in case you didn't notice, I've been learning a lot from this process too, and your session really helped in that regard for helping me to understand how to read portraits, and to go much deeper than even what we see on the surface. So that too is something we often overlook, is how to actually read it. So, and thanks to everyone who shared their lesson ideas, their suggestions, who played along, if you will, and really learned alongside with all of us today. Let me also make a special note. A few times during the day today you heard some music being played, and we want to thank Smithsonian Folkways for providing that music, and you'll find links on the site to their site as well. Don't forget, this was day 1 of a 2-day conference, so we'll all be back again tomorrow with 4 fantastic sessions, and you can check out the program. We'll also be bringing science in a bigger way, and I know that we've had online with us Senior Curator Tom Crouch, who will be talking about what's called Mr. Lincoln's Air Force. That is one of 4 great sessions tomorrow. So looking forward to having you back. We'll have all the recordings from today posted within the next couple of hours, if they're not there already, and we will see you all on day 2. Thanks again, and Briana, thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's been a pleasure.